Okay, so just in the interest of time, I see we have like a couple of attendees, but since this meeting is being recorded, those who missed the first half will be able to access it later. But you know, for those of you who have joined us, thanks for being prompt and on time. Welcome to the quarterly edition, spring edition for Pulse on the Principles webinar series. I'm Claudine Lyman. I'm the manager for the Principles for Digital Development at Dial. So today's webinar is about how the digital principles apply to AI regulations and responsibilities. So as technology and digital tools become more commonplace in every aspect of our lives and work, we've seen a surge of interest and use of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And these tools have already had a profound impact in the field of international development. And we see this in examples like interactive maps, data-driven predictions, smart cities, and other things like that. And this is really just the beginning. And there's tremendous potential to achieve the sustainable development goals at an accelerated rate with these sorts of tools. But as we all know, with technology, it also poses significant risks and concerns, such as privacy and security, as I just mentioned, machine bias, and lack of inclusivity are issues that are flagged, but there's always questions about who's ultimately responsible in finding solutions. And there's like so many actors involved in developing and using and investing in these tools that sometimes those lines can get blurred. So for today's conversation, we're going to be kind of asking questions about practical steps that implementers and partners can take to confirm that AI solutions are best suited and built for programming needs. And as a standalone, the digital principles are really fantastic guidelines to developing these sorts of tools and projects, but it's really an opportunity to see how they might apply to this topic. So with me today, we have a very cozy discussion. I have Carlos from the UNDP Accelerator Labs and Marla from the Association for Progressive Communications. And I don't like to do very formal introductions. I'll have them sort of talk about themselves in a few moments. But I just like to start off the conversation just to sort of set foundational understanding for this conversation. So for the kickoff question, you know, maybe Carlos, you can start us off. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your work at UNDP, and maybe tell the audience the difference between AI and machine learning.
Thank you, Claudine. So, and hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. So as Claudine mentioned, my name is Carlos Mazariegos. I'm currently part of the UNDP Accelerator Labs. Specifically, I'm in charge in what is called exploration in the lab from Guatemala, where I'm originally from. And the idea behind this network of labs is somehow to tackle development challenges in a different way, because there's the recognition from UNDP that development challenges are advancing at a really fast pace, and then the complexity is really high. So in that sense, is somehow bringing like new methodologies, tools, including AI tools for tackling this complexity. Now, regarding to your question, Claudine, about artificial intelligence, I believe it was the difference between machine learning, sorry. So it's actually like some kind of like blurry concept, and is used sometimes interchangeably, especially in the industry. But one of the key aspects is artificial intelligence is referring a little bit more to a human-like intelligence, somehow mimicking the capabilities of what we do as humans and even beyond. And in that sense, machine learning is rather like a sub-concept or a subset of that broader concept from artificial intelligence, where the main goal of machine learning is learning from experience. So it's about learning where you have a specific task, you have then an experience, and the idea would be to improve a specific performance.
Thank you, Carlos, for setting that foundation for the audience. And then Marwa, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and then maybe about, in your experience, how you have used AI and or machine learning and any specific examples around that?
Thank you, Claudine. Thank you for having me. And just like you started off this conversation, I guess we're all somewhat not really AI experts because multi-stakeholderism is really inherent to the AI field. And so we need a different wide range of expertise to really build what is called like socially just or socially just AI. And just for the sake of this conversation, I'll just say AI because machine learning is part of artificial intelligence. But before I'll introduce myself, I work for the Association for Progressive Communications as a policy advocacy coordinator for the Women's Rights Program. So we basically work at the intersection of gender and technology, but more so into intersectional approaches to technology by reimagining alternatives to technology, innovation, including artificial intelligence, and what does it mean really concretely. We also have our feminist, what we call the feminist principles of the internet, which includes a wide range of sets and guidelines and practices for different audiences. But before, I would just say, because I'm also an IT engineer, and perhaps just to simplify the concept, I would say that actually they're used interchangeably when they shouldn't be, because it just adds unnecessary complexity to an already complex environment. So an algorithm is simply any form of automated decision. It can be just a simple like if then statement. So for instance, if you press that button, then the action would be executed. Whereas algorithms are the building blocks that make up, machine learning and artificial intelligence. There is a distinct difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is that machine learning use structured data and to be programmed and to just execute a task. But artificial intelligence can actually cope with circumstances and use unstructured data. But why we still confused? Simply because we can't, or it's not an easy or piece of cake to understand whether the underlying data is structured or unstructured. And that's why we keep confusing them both, but it's actually machine learning is part of AI using structured data, and the difference in short is that algorithm just helps make the decision, whereas AI is used to train that data, if that makes sense. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. So, now that we have like those base definitions set out, perhaps I'll bounce it back to Carlos. I would love to know a little bit more about your work at UNDP. And I know you previously worked at MIT, with how you guys were specifically working with AI and, how you were either using or developing those sorts of resources.
Thank you, Claudine. In terms of UNDP, I actually recently joined this Vibrant network. So it's like a global learning network. As I mentioned, the idea is to tackle development challenges in a different way. I think it's important to mention that we are a network of there are 91 labs right now, covering about 115 countries. And the idea is that each lab is part of a country office. There's many labs. You can find it in the website in Africa, Asia, Latin America. And I'm part of the second cohort in that sense. So our work is, as I mentioned, is very dynamic. And one of the core concepts is that we work in learning cycles. So we define like learning questions similar to a research question, but how you take that into action, and then and tackling learning cycles in about 100 days, pretty much leveraging the capabilities of each lab, where we are 3 members, in exploring solutions mapping or local solutions from local communities. Also investigating about what are the new trends, tendencies, and disruptive technologies like AI or blockchain. And then also performing experiments and having a portfolio of experiments to really learn what works and what doesn't for your local context. So that's pretty much what the Accelerator Lab Network is. And about your second question, I am actually still part of MIT Connection Science. It's an institute at MIT. I'm currently a fellow there, and my participation before with this group was in a project named OPAL for open algorithms, where different partners, let's say academic partners, private industry, and other partners were somehow trying to leverage the value behind big data, specifically in the private sector for the social good. So I was very fortunate to be working with top scientists and pretty much leading this kind of work in computational social science and social analytics. Besides MIT, Imperial College of London was also involved, and as well as Telefonica from Spain and Orange from France. And the idea was to somehow analyze the data that is produced in the telecom operators, like it's called metadata, it's data about data, and then how you can reutilize that to compute socioeconomic indicators, for instance, population density or mobility indicators, for local solutions, for local decision makers. So the end users were actually the National Statistics Offices, local universities, NGOs, and other international organizations. And there were 2 pilots that were launched. One was in Colombia with Telefonica, that was for the Latin American region. And the second one was in Senegal with Orange Sonatel, for the African region.
Cool. So I wanted to pull a little bit on a thread that you said, you do a lot of work about and research on like what works and what doesn't work. And so this is a question to both Marwa and Carlos. So I want to get like really specific about, the ways in which AI is being used in international development work. So I would love to hear some specific examples and to hear, what has worked, what risks do we still grapple with? I know we talk a lot about like surveillance, bias, inclusivity issues. So maybe Marwa, you can kind of start with giving us like some really like concrete examples about like what you have experienced or, have done research on.
Yeah, I guess it's a very good question to ask about what has worked, because we usually start off with what doesn't actually work. But from our experience, I guess I see there is value in having artificial intelligence to, for instance, help make some lived experiences better for both women, men, and people of diverse genders and sexualities, be it by using bots to alleviate or reduce the prevalence of violence online, hate speech against minorities, and how we use different sort of AI-driven practices to moderate content on platforms, help just get more specific responses using, again, machine learning and structured data to understand the how it's fed, and just to understand the impacts behind that chain. But I guess when it comes to, and that shouldn't be overstated, but I guess when it comes to lived experiences of women and minorities, we're still at a sort of embryonic stage of development. We have some sort of guidelines that help us go through this process. For instance, we have the Human Rights Impact Assessment within that framework of the UN Business and Human Rights. We have the principles for digital development, and we have other feminist principles, but it's still not seen from a holistic approach, you know, because it's not just about applying that or just having that vote to reduce the prevalence of violence or to understand the lived experiences of a user online, but it's more so about how we can really interplay between data, AI, and human behavior. And that's what we are currently trying to understand by bridging that gender feminist theory and AI governance, which currently has not been done yet. So it's like giving a toolbox for regulators and policymakers to step up their knowledge game. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you actually touched on something interesting about, like, you know, how we're using AI to understand lived experience of vulnerable groups, whether it's, you know, women, minorities, people with disabilities. And so I think this actually gets into the topic about informed consent, which I think the audience is pretty interested in. So, you know, as we're collecting data, are these users, like, how are they being informed that their data is being collected, and how are we educating them on how it's being used, stored, and shared? And I open it to either of you right now.
So thank you, Claudine. I think that's a really good point in the sense of more like the core ethical principles. And I would like maybe to frame this in like on how research works. For instance, there's I don't know if you might be aware about this Belmont report that is pretty much like a foundational document that is used in research. And when it's specifically involving like the ethical considerations and involving human subjects. So there are three principles in that sense, in the sense of respect for persons, that is about informed consent and confidentiality, like if individuals should be treated as autonomous agents or not. The second principle is about beneficence, and it's about if an individual or society, if there are enough benefits that could somehow outweigh or justify the risks. And the third one is about justice. So this is like very like some concepts that from research and more like from academia, and most economists use that. It is very well regulated in the sense of knowing about this informed consent. Unfortunately, when we go maybe to some kind of industries or this AI or big data sector, most of these core ethical concepts might not be taken into consideration. And one of the key elements, I believe, is about where the data is located, right? Who is the data holder and who's having those rights so far, at least for the private sector. This kind of non-traditional data sources like telecom operators, like the big high-tech companies, they are the holders, even though the data has been produced by users' behavior. And as Marwa was saying, the human behavior is another key concept. So at least in that sense, the data sharing, where the power is located, is actually somehow driving the utilization of this.
I can also add to this that we actually see that sort of informed consent. And actually we need to also stress on the word informed, because when we assume that is informed consent, then we assume that this data subject is someone who actually understands what's between the lines, which sometimes is not the case. But again, for us, we see it as a threat to what we call digital bodily integrity, and how you actually see your autonomy online as a person. and as a digital subject. So I guess that consent must be freely given, specific and unambiguous, because in order to obtain freely given consent, it must be given on a voluntary basis. And if there is any element of inappropriate pressure or influence which could affect the outcome of that choice, it just renders that consent invalid. And of course, we need, in that specific case, we need to talk about local ownership and how consent is seen different in different environments. So that's really important to emphasize, because still in AI governance, we still lack that rooted in context principle, where we give sort of indications that one size fits all and everyone can give informed consent in any environment, which is not the case. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this then kind of opens up the door to like the namesake of this webinar, which is, regulations and responsibilities. So we're talking a lot about, local ownership, data storage, informed consent. So who is like ultimately responsible for making sure that, beneficiaries are educated on this? And there's that line between international development practitioners, experts, and the actual like technologists. So how do they collaborate together to make sure that, these sort of ethical standards are upheld?
I can go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, and speak to that. Okay, so I actually think it's the $1 million question, because the real problem lies within the coordination. We have a lot of wealth of expertise, but it's still siloed. And I guess we still actually see AI governance as a standalone. And currently, the current contemporary regulations and governance are not sufficient. I guess for me, first, is it because it's because of the language semantics? It's actually the culture and the worries between different chains of services and of responsibilities. So for instance, in the health field, we would have someone from like a doctor or a medical. We would have the one who works with the actual data. So we have different semantics and different cultural differences underlying there. So and I actually I saw a very like fun translation for that, which it says like it's like the how do you eat your broccoli, because we all know that the broccoli is healthy, but at the very end of the day we don't know how to translate that. So I guess the question is, how do we know it is sufficient? Where is that endpoint? And I guess education and awareness building should go beyond that echo chamber. And that's why I said no one can be a sort of like AI expert or evangelist, because the multi-stakeholderism aspect of AI is very inherent. And we need to go beyond this echo chamber where we just have that international development phase, or we just assume that AI innovation emerged from a specific context, let's say the US-based context or the North-based context. So we need to know that everyone should be equipped to a certain degree to create that opportunities for, at least for discussion, where most people would relate. And the last thing that I would mention is the research priorities. We need to invest more in research and just bridging the gap between, for instance, feminist theory and practice and AI, and the technical community needs to be more involved in these discussions around policy development. and the tech giants need to be more held accountable for the current impacts on or let's say the societal cost to technology development. Yeah.
Awesome. Carlos, anything to add to that? Any words of wisdom about how we can better coordinate between like all these different actors?
Yes, thank you. I would like to mention a few points and really on the line on what Marwa was mentioning. First, there are actually, at least on tackling this gap, right? There's this recognition right now that you have, yes, some apparent like very advanced technologies where this kind of technologies, or at least AI, this is actually coming from different disciplines, right? Including statistics, mathematics, information theory, even psychology and other topics, and neurology. So the more knowledgeable are the decision makers, where there's actually that gap between the technology and actually the decision making in terms of, at least for development, right? The more knowledge these decision makers have, the better they will understand, okay, how they can use it and for what purposes. For instance, there are specific machine learning algorithms that are good for specific contexts and to tackle specific problems, like classification problems. Let's say if you have oranges and apple, you can easily have a classifier that will tell you very quickly this kind of information with very high accuracy. But there might be other problems that even AI, the current state of technology, might not be helpful. So that's very important to understand. Second, I believe that also in terms of how to tackle this, there are already some interesting like accountability and transparency mechanisms from a more like governance component. For instance, from MIT Connection Science, and also like it was embedded in this open algorithms project, besides the technological component of having, let's say, privacy and security and different algorithms to compute the specific indicators, there was also a governance component. This was called a Council for Orientation of Development and Ethics. And the idea, it was some kind of participatory governance framework designed to protect privacy and hold these AI projects to the highest ethical standards. So in each council, you can have participation from different sectors, let's say national, local governments, entities, civil society, and at the end to have this kind of creating trust on how you utilize these kind of technologies. And I'll leave it here, but at the end, the idea would be also this participatory, sorry, one last point, is actually very important to have it since the beginning of any kind of AI project. So it's not really useful when you bring like a finalized solution to someone else and say you can use this, as opposite as bring it these decision makers from different sectors while you're building your algorithms.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit because you mentioned, having to sort of build these mechanisms or like ideas from the onset of the project. So we're going to talk a little, I would love to talk a little bit more about, risks and issues with AI, because I think many perceive technology and AI as like, a neutral actor, but we know it's not. Data is really a reflection of life, and many times it's unequal, it's biased, and really complex. And so the data that's used to train AI systems can build prejudice into the AI systems. And there tends to be a lot, maybe too much trust placed in the algorithms and not enough mechanisms for recourse. So how do we, I guess, first of all, address this as international development practitioners? And Marwa, I would love to hear more about, the gendered approach and how organizations may be using AI in the field to, address this problem while also mitigating the risks that are involved. So yeah, Marwa, go ahead, start us off, please. And then Carlos, I'll let you tap in.
Yeah, I guess for me, we need to actually press the pause button, because we're just seeing a lot of AI solutions that are being implemented without currently overseeing the impacts or studying how this would unfold in a longer term. And I don't know if this is more sort of like technology solutionism mindset, where we see any problem has a tech-driven solution or an AI-based solution. And I guess currently why we need to press the pause button is just we need to understand what we've made during all these past 30 years, ever since we started this technology revolution. And for that specifically within the circumstances of COVID-19 and how we've seen that social inequalities have been replicated, we've seen the emergence of other trends that we've never actually faced before. And some trends are even unrevealed and they're critically gendered. And we've seen how women had to drop out of that digital system, how women leaders have been really targeted. And I guess this goes beyond AI itself to the question of how power is being shaped, mediated, and it's just being unfolding in our societies. I guess it's more about how we're situated within these wider debates about the role of government in society and the power of tech and tech giants to disrupt society as we know it. So currently, I will go back to that specific point, because we're seeing a sort of like big tech giants governing themselves. And this is how it's leading or it's leaning towards in this current or in this very critical inflection point of history. So it goes back to the question that we need to capture and to redefine power as we have always known it and experienced it. Because we would never be able to really create a very, context-based impact if you're not able to really work hand in hand with those who hold the power from the get-go. And that's what we're currently trying to do by investing more in feminist research, because it gives you a very a very critical picture of the power dynamics between different communities and how they experience oppression differently. And we actually, of course, invest in the global South because there is still a wider gap, whether we want to admit it or not, between how we create, deploy, and govern technologies in the global South and the global North. So we actually just export technology and we use it and try to experience simulations of it. I'm just chasing after my thoughts, but that's it.
I think that's a great point. Actually, the power is actually one of the key elements here. I completely agree with Marwa in that sense. And it reminds me actually also like about some efforts in building data cooperatives or data collaboratives from different groups, where there's this recognition as, for instance, actually some research also from MIT brings this analogy on how credit unions were built, in the sense of before, like the banking system, there was this kind of challenges and tensions about people's rights. And then that's how these credit unions were formed. And right now there's this recognition on we are facing like a similar kind of thing. And the key thing will be how can we transfer the power to the people who is generating the data, So they are able to somehow decide on how their data is utilized, how their data is transformed, and when it should be like eliminated. So that's definitely like a key thing. And I completely agree with Marwa as well, in the sense that this goes beyond just the technical concepts of AI. At the end, as I was mentioning, AI brings different disciplines, and it's pretty much like a state-of-the-art a combination between statistics, technologies, computer science, and other disciplines. But at the end of the day, you do have humans somehow making those decisions for either developing an AI system in a sort of way, or somehow implementing the insights that you generate from AI systems for specific uses. So in that sense, there are definitely, at least for humanitarian and development practitioners, it's very important to be aware of these unintended consequences that are directly threaten the principles that I was referring before in terms of beneficence and justice and respect for persons as well. And I would like also to bring another unintended consequence that sometimes is even missed, and it's the actual impact that goes beyond we as humans. So beyond humans' rights, there's also some kind of negative impact to our environment. So in the last UNDP Human Development Report, one of the key findings was that for the first time in history, we as humans and human activity is changing our environment, the environment where we live. So it's called the new era of the Anthropocene. And for instance, bringing back to the AI, say like technologies and other disruptive technologies, we are already seeing some, let's say, footprints in the sense of carbon emissions, where if you train a specific AI algorithms, specifically, one of the examples can be from natural language processing, where you need like millions of texts. And usually you do need to store and process all this information somewhere, right? As Marwa was saying before, you need to convert that into structured data. So you need computing power, and that computing power has some costs. And right now, even though there are data centers like worldwide, especially from the tech companies, there has been even a comparison of executing or training an AI algorithm for natural language processing could be equivalent to over 100, the emissions, sorry, could be equivalent to over 100 flights, like two-way between New York and Europe. In that sense of somehow to having this kind of sense of even the impact on the environment that this is causing.
And so we talk a lot about unintended consequences of using technology or AI. But I suppose my next question is then again about responsibility. So when these things happen, how do we either fix the problem, and who's held accountable, and in what ways are these folks held accountable? And Mara, I did see that you had your hand up, so if you have any comments to Carlos's point, do address that now.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about what we call actually structurally silenced people, because we believe that when we actually work, for instance, with AI or with any actually given technology, it's not the technology itself that is making that glitch we need to fix, but it's actually the system that is built on it. And we currently talk about surveillance capitalism, for instance, and how we see that, that sort of disciplining of platforms, where we're currently being disciplined through algorithms that are being based on various business reasons to maximize profits. So we would find these huge misinformation campaigns that are just being replicated because the more you share fake news, the more it gets viral, the more the AI bots would help to to reshare it and reproduce it, and so on and so forth. So I guess it's really important to acknowledge that we need to actually to unlearn. We talk about deep learning, but right now we need to unlearn how we've been, how we've just seen surveillance studies, for instance, and how we talk about another issue around capacity building that is actually used to surveil different people. And we've had the case with, for instance, AI capacity building interventions in authoritarian settings, where it's actually used to surveil human rights defenders, to surveil people who plead for environmental justice. And we actually plead against those big data centers that are just out of nowhere overnight are being built in authoritarian countries. And we know that it's not just a data warehouse, but it's more, you know, just a control tower. Yeah, so I'm just looming around, but yeah.
Carlos, did you want to add anything to that about, like, you know, Mara, we were talking about just like unintended consequences and, you know, who's responsible and what does accountability actually look like in practice? Because we always say, like, you know, we need to hold governments or organizations accountable if there's like misuse of like data, but what does that look like in good practice and good faith?
Yeah, I think at least for like some of the, let's say, like maybe the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Some of the lights at the end of the tunnel are these frameworks or mechanisms for transparency and accountability. So in that sense, yes, there's a need of beyond like the technical part of this governance part, and how even though, for instance, in developing countries, there are no regulations on how personal information could be utilized. Some of them are advancing on that, but the European community is way ahead, then followed by the US and other regions. So these kind of governance components, even though there might not be specific regulations that could back up, let's say, citizens, there are ways to somehow redesign digital-driven societies, and that's pretty much like one of the end goals, right? How in this like digital economy can we redesign ourselves, and how, as Marwa was saying, can we unlearn, right? So these kind of lights at the end of the tunnel that I was mentioning are just like governance structures that, as I mentioned before, like having councils in terms of ethics and how you're utilizing that, and having that transparent and providing some mechanisms to being accountable, like this council that I mentioned, that they are already being deployed in some countries, also with the support of Data Pop Alliance, another organization that is somehow leading these efforts. And I would like also to mention one specific case that maybe as a more concrete example, and it's about how you target poverty from a government. So for instance, if we have this concrete example on how you have an annual budget, right? Let's say you're a Ministry of Education, and you do need to somehow implement some specific programs where your decision making depends on some kind of base ground truth, right? That usually comes from census or surveys. So there are already some systems that are being deployed that are intelligent systems combining both artificial intelligence and human intelligence. So there are some concepts that have been developed, for instance, active fairness, where you do have, well, let's say, besides collecting specific data from administrative data, you do involve these decision makers in the process. So you have both kind of intelligence, again, the artificial intelligence and the human intelligence, to make the decisions and somehow learn on how that's having impact on your social programs. So these kind of systems are being deployed right now as well. And these are also like some of the lies at the end of the tunnel that I was mentioning initially, like bringing together these other like governance components into the decision making. And at the end of the day, it's about impacting these vulnerable populations, right? And how not leaving them behind. So yeah, I'll leave it here.
Thank you. So I have one more question before I delve into the questions that people had submitted in the RSVP form. So my final question is, we talk a lot about, making data sets inclusive, because, there's still a lot of invisibility for vulnerable groups in some existing data sets, and, their special context or needs aren't really addressed. But then on the other hand, we talk a lot about data security, privacy, things like that. So I suppose my question to you guys is the approach to aggregated versus disaggregated data. Like, when is it appropriate to use either one, and how do practitioners sort of make those calls? Like, when is it appropriate to use one or the other? And perhaps we can start off with Marwa.
I mean, I'll definitely think that we need more of gender disaggregated data, but also not just gender disaggregated data, but also that sort of data that it's not really data, it's unstructured data that we need to restructure it to get more information. Because right now, and that is a potential solution, is that we need to document what's going on. We don't know what's going on, and we don't have the resources to know what's going on. And so when we currently try to do research or to implement new policy responses, we actually struggle to find the extent to which these impacts have been harmful on different communities. And I guess if we can get some sort of data pictures that are longitudinal, and that goes into really longer term, which would give us more space, but also more room to understand how it's been disproportionately impacting different communities at different levels and layers of vulnerability. We would then be able to at least give solutions that would not lead to further social injustices. I guess what has been done as just is there, but we can at least carry the responsibility of carving out more public engagement and sharing information on how that systems work or not, to ensure accountability and trust of AI-based innovation, but also to give the user the ability to opt out of the system, because we currently cannot afford to disengage. It's like that we're enslaved in that system. So it's very important to become more cognizant of experience through more disaggregated data and more investment in proper documentation, but also that is, of course, built on transparency and openness. Yeah.
I love that emphasis just on, just like really making sure that, the user is informed and educated. That's such like a big theme with digital principles these days. But so Carlos, what about you? Any recommendations for, how practitioners should approach or make decisions about aggregated versus disaggregated data?
Yes, thank you. There is one interesting concept that might help when somehow thinking about this kind of challenge. I think it's very context specific, because if we're talking about aggregation of data, let's say talking about satellite imagery is not the same as data from social media or census data, administrative data, or telecom data. But in that sense, there's some also interesting research in the sense of understanding this utility and risk of the identification trade-off. So there are already some interesting results in the sense of, for instance, if you're a private company, currently a data holder, and I'll just take the example of telecom operators, where I have been more involved in the sector. The main objective is, of course, your business, right? That's in the telecom sector. And then you do need to protect your customers and private information. But on the other hand, you do have, let's say, government institutions like government agencies, like national statistics offices, that some indicators might be very valuable for the decision-making of social programs. And actually, there's usually a trade-off in terms of aggregation and anonymization, where, for instance, from the telecom side, sharing individual level at very low granularity, both from geographical and temporal granularities, might not be possible. And that's usually like a blocker when you as a practitioner you want to have access to this kind of data. But then when you actually realize that for decision makers, let's say the granularity might be enough to have a municipality level, maybe monthly indicators. So in that sense, there might be this kind of common ground where data holders, it wouldn't pose like very high risk in terms of the identification. And of course, you can add security on the top on how you access that information. So my recommendation to any practitioner would be to analyze this trade-off for your specific context, for your specific data source, and what you want to use that for. And it's very likely that you're gonna find this common ground.
So I think a good rule of thumb is that there is really no rule of thumb, and just to understand the context and purpose that you're working with. Awesome. So we just have about just a little under 10 minutes left. So I'm going to, so for those of you in the audience, if you have any burning questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, but many of you have submitted questions when you RSVP'd for this webinar. So I'll just start there. So I will start off with asking about, can any monitoring, eval, learning approaches help improve the way we use AI? And do any MEL approaches currently exist that we should know about? And I'll give you two a moment to think about it and maybe answer whenever you're ready.
Sorry, Claudine, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. So are there any like monitoring, evaluation, learning, MEL approaches that can help improve the way that we build and use AI? And like what sort of indicators are being used or should we use?
Perhaps briefly, I would say that currently we have these sort of evaluation and monitoring being done on the basis of automated decision. And we can clearly see that in instances of, for instance, content moderation using AI. And we've seen, for instance, how just a simple instance of language diversity, we found that for Arabic was the least represented, even though we have different like sort of context and cultural diversities and tribes, ethnicities, so on and so forth. And what I want to say is that, of course, capacity-wise, we can just have humans be doing everything to monitor these cases, but we need to have specific guidelines that really support that automated decisions. And I guess, again, we need to re-challenge the way we've been monitoring and evaluating those applications. We have a great resource, again, in the Human Rights Impact Assessment of Digital Activities, although it is still not gendered, but we're convincing them to have a more holistic approach and integrating more lived experiences again of humans. Yeah.
Yeah, I will quickly like to add, of course, like the default, at least for AI systems and machine learning algorithms, like the default way of evaluating the performance are specific metrics. As I mentioned at the beginning, when we think, let's say, about machine learning, you have a specific task where you're trying to improve a performance metric based on experience. So these performance metrics are usually like accuracy, and another like similar, like true positive, true negative kind of metrics. But, and these are like core concepts in econometrics, statistics, right? But then it's important to also, there are some interesting examples on having other kind of metrics in your systems. For instance, like parity metrics on how, as Margot was saying, not excluding specific types of population that can come from your sample data where you train an algorithm to the actual application. This kind of evaluation and monitoring, you can have it constantly and you can integrate that into your system. There's another example that comes to my mind that is about nutrition label of the data sets. And this is like some kind of, if you have like a bottle of water or some kind of juice, right? At the back, you have your nutrition label where it says how much sugar it has and these kind of things. So there are some interesting efforts in having this kind of nutrition label from data sets and actually knowing where it's coming from, what are the characteristics, are you excluding or including some populations. So these kind of efforts can definitely be adopted into monitoring and evaluation.
Next question is, we talked about like so many like different risks and ethical concerns with AI, but what would you two say are like the top 2 ethical issues that humanitarian and development practitioners should keep in mind with, using AI and ML?
From my side, I would like to mention 2. One will be exacerbating inequalities, as we already talked, right? In terms of really excluding or leaving behind the ones that you don't want, you are not hoping to do that, but then from your algorithm, that might be an unintended consequence. And the second one, as I mentioned before, is just about the environment, because just this computing power and all the processing that you do need behind the scenes, that can have like a really huge impact if we are not aware about these like massive technologies, like the actual cost to society.
Yeah, there's like, the sustainability part, but in the environmental sense, let's say. Marwa?
I mean, of course, I joined Carlos in that point, but I would just add some cherries on top. I guess for me, it's the assuming consent in context of unequal power dynamics. And one simple example would be the sort of uneasy access, because we assume that everyone has access to AI, which is not the case. And also the concern around heightened surveillance, because we currently heightened mass surveillance, and how these AI algorithms are being used to discipline mass populations, to sway outcomes of political elections, of decision-making processes, which really doesn't give agency to people to get control over their destiny, their fate, their data, their daily life, and how they control their autonomy online. And this is really something concerning in the longer term, with more AI innovations currently being used in different contexts. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. And I think just like to your point, shameless plug that just like if you're very interested in like things like government surveillance, social credit systems, government control, things like that, highly recommend the show Alice in Borderland on Netflix. Blew my mind, but it really goes into like themes of like how AI can be used to like discipline communities and things like that. But I think like that's at the top of the, it's 11:30. Thank you guys so much for sitting with me for the hour and talking about all of this. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you to the audience for joining today. If you have any questions, you know where to reach us. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Bye.
Bye.